The air in the room was thick with tension. A storm was brewing, not outside, but within the walls of this very office. Moscow had gone silent, and when Moscow went silent, it only meant one thing, they knew. Somewhere in the shadows, a ghost of the past was already on the move, heading straight toward them, a master of deception, a man who could be anyone, anywhere, the infamous Number 16. Tommy and Tuppence sat across from the chief in his private office, the dim lamplight casting sharp shadows on the walls. The weight of their latest success hung in the air. 5 key agents had been captured, their operations disrupted, and their network fractured, but there was no time to celebrate. The chief's expression, usually unreadable, was lined with concern. "You two have done a remarkable job," he admitted, his voice carrying the warmth of rare praise. "Because of your work we've gained intelligence that could shake the very foundations of their operations. But," he leaned forward, his gaze sharpening, "there's a problem, a rather serious one." Tommy exchanged a glance with Tuppence. They had both been in this game long enough to know what came next. "I've received word from a highly credible source," the chief continued, lowering his voice, "that Moscow is alarmed. Their agents have failed to report back, and despite our best efforts at secrecy, headquarters has begun to suspect that something is terribly wrong at their distributing center, what we know as the International Detective Bureau, under the name of Mr. Theodore Blunt." Tommy exhaled slowly, drumming his fingers against the armrest. "Well," he said with forced nonchalance, "they were bound to figure it out sooner or later, sir." "Indeed." The chief steepled his fingers. "But what concerns me most is not that they suspect something, but how they will respond." His gaze flickered to Tuppence. "And I'm particularly worried about Mrs. Tommy. I can handle myself just fine." Tuppence cut in swiftly, "Just as Tommy said, I'll take care of her, sir." The chief sighed. "That excessive confidence of yours, both of yours, has always been rather infuriating. I won't deny that you've got skill, but let's not forget that luck has played its part, and luck, my dear friends, has a nasty habit of changing when you least expect it." He leaned back in his chair. "Now I suppose it's useless to ask Mrs. Tommy to keep a low profile for the next week or so." Tuppence's sharp shake of the head was answer enough. The chief sighed again. "Then all I can do is prepare you for what's coming. Because we know this much, Moscow isn't just sitting back and licking its wounds. They've already sent someone." Tommy sat up straighter, his instincts kicking in. "Who?" "We don't know his name. We don't know when he's arriving, but we do know who he is." A cold prickle ran down Tommy's spine. The chief's voice had dropped to an ominous whisper. "He's a ghost. A man who has haunted intelligence operations since the war, a master of deception, a man fluent in 6 languages, capable of passing as any nationality, including our own, a chameleon, a strategist, and above all dangerous. We call him Number 16. The air in the room seemed to grow colder. "It was he who created the Number 16 code," the chief continued. "He has slipped through our fingers more times than I care to count. And now he's coming for you." A heavy silence followed. Tommy leaned forward. "Do we know how he'll come?" The chief gave a slow nod. "Yes, we believe he will come straight to you, Tommy. To the office of Theodore Blunt. He will pose as a client, with a fabricated case. He will test you. He will use the passwords." Tuppence's fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt. Tommy's jaw tightened. "And if we fail the test?" The chief's expression darkened. "Then you won't live long enough to regret it. The first, as you know, is the mention of the number 16, which is replied to by a sentence containing the same number. The second, which we have only just learnt, is an inquiry as to whether you have ever crossed the Channel. The answer to that is, I was in Berlin on the 13th of last month. As far as we know, that is all. I would suggest that you reply correctly, and so endeavor to gain his confidence. Sustain the fiction if you possibly can, but even if he appears to be completely deceived, remain on your guard. Our friend is particularly astute, and can play a double game as well, or better than you can. But in either case, I hope to get him through you. From this day forward I am adopting special precautions. A dictaphone was installed last night in your office. so that one of my men in the room below will be able to hear everything that passes in your office. In this way, I shall be immediately informed if anything arises, and can take the necessary steps to safeguard you and your wife, whilst securing the man I am after." After a few more instructions, and a general discussion of tactics, the two young people departed, and made their way as rapidly as possible to the office of Blunt's brilliant detectives. "It's late," said Tommy, looking at his watch. "Just on 12 o'clock. We've been a long time with the chief. I hope we haven't missed a particularly spicy case." "On the whole," said Tuppence, "we've not done badly. I was tabulating results the other day. We've solved 4 baffling murder mysteries, rounded up a gang of counterfeiters, ditto a gang of smugglers. Actually 2 gangs, interpolated." "Tommy, so we have. I'm glad of that. Gangs sounds so professional," Tuppence continued, ticking off the items on her fingers. 1 jewel robbery, 2 escapes from violent death, 1 case of missing lady reducing her figure, 1 young girl befriended, an alibi successfully exploded, and alas, 1 case where we made utter fools of ourselves. On the whole, jolly good. We're very clever, I think." "You would think so," said Tommy. "You always do. Now I have a secret feeling that once or twice we've been rather lucky." "Nonsense," said Tuppence. "All done by the little grey cells." "Well, I was damned lucky once," said Tommy. "The day that Albert did his lasso act. But you speak, Tuppence, as though it was all over." "So it is," said Tuppence. She lowered her voice impressively. "This is our last case. When they have laid the super spy by the heels, the great detectives intend to retire and take to beekeeping or vegetable marrow growing. It's always done. Tired of it, eh?" "Yes, I think I am. Besides, we're so successful now. The luck might change." "Who's talking about luck now?" asked Tommy triumphantly. At that moment they turned in at the doorway of the block of buildings in which the International Detective Bureau had its offices, and Tuppence did not reply. Albert was on duty in the outer office, employing his leisure in balancing, or endeavoring to balance, the office ruler upon his nose. With a stern frown of reproof, the great Mr. Blunt passed into his own private office. Divesting himself of his overcoat and hat, he opened the cupboard, on the shelves of which reposed his classic library of the great detectives of fiction. "The choice narrows," murmured Tommy. "On whom shall I model myself today?" Tuppence's voice, with an unusual note in it, made him turn sharply. "Tommy," she said, "what day of the month is it?" "Let me see. The 11th. Why, look at the calendar." Hanging on the wall was one of those calendars from which you tear a leaf every day. It bore the legend of Sunday the 16th. Today was Monday. "By Jove, that's odd. Albert must have torn off too many. Careless little devil." "I don't believe he did," said Tuppence. "But we'll ask him." Albert, summoned and questioned, seemed very astonished. He swore he had only torn off 1 leaf, that of the day before. His statement was presently supported, for whereas the leaf torn off by Albert was found in the grate, the succeeding ones were lying in the waste paper basket. "A neat and methodical criminal," said Tommy. "Who's been here this morning?" "Albert." "A client of any kind?" "Just one, sir." "What was he like?" "It was a she, a hospital nurse, very upset and anxious to see you, said she'd wait until you came. I put her in clerks because it was warmer, and from there she could walk in here, of course, without your seeing her." "How long has she been gone?" "About half an hour, sir. Said she'd call again this afternoon. A nice motherly looking body. A nice motherly. Oh, get out, Albert." Albert withdrew, injured. "Queer start, that," said Tommy. "It seems a little purposeless, puts us on our guard. I suppose there isn't a bomb concealed in the fireplace or anything of that kind." He reassured himself on that point. Then he seated himself at the desk and addressed Tuppence. "Mon ami," he said, "we are here faced with a matter of the utmost gravity. You recall, do you not, the man who was Marfort, him whom I crushed like an eggshell in the Dolomites, with the aid of high explosives, bien entendu. But he was not really dead. No, they are never really dead, these super criminals. This is the man, but even more so, if I may so put it. He is the 4 squared, in other words, he is now the 62. You comprehend, my friend. Perfectly, said Tuppence. You are the great Hercule Poirot. Exactly. No moustaches, but lots of grey cells. I've a feeling, said Tuppence, that this particular adventure will be called The Triumph of Hastings. Never, said Tommy. It isn't done. Once the idiot friend, always the idiot friend. There's an etiquette in these matters. By the way, Manami, can you not part your hair in the middle instead of one side? The present effect is unsymmetrical and deplorable. The buzzer rang sharply on Tommy's desk. He returned the signal, and Albert appeared bearing a card. Prince Vladirovsky, read Tommy in a low voice. He looked at Tuppence. I wonder, show him in, Albert. The man who entered was of middle height, graceful in bearing, with a fair beard and apparently about 35 years of age. Mr. Blunt, he inquired. His English was perfect. You have been most highly recommended to me. Will you take up a case for me? If you will give me the details. Certainly. It concerns the daughter of a friend of mine, a girl of 16. We are anxious for no scandal. You understand. My dear sir, said Tommy, this business has been running successfully for 16 years owing to our strict attention to that particular principle. He fancied he saw a sudden gleam in the other's eye. If so, it passed as quickly as it came. You have branches, I believe, on the other side of the channel. Yes, as a matter of fact, he brought out the word with great deliberation. I myself was in Berlin on the 13th of last month. In that case, said the stranger, it is hardly necessary to keep up the little fiction. The daughter of my friend can be conveniently dismissed. You know who I am. At any rate, I see you have had warning of my coming. He nodded towards the calendar on the wall. Quite so, said Tommy. My friends, I have come over here to investigate matters. What has been happening? Treachery, said Tuppence, no longer able to remain quiescent. The Russian shifted his attention to her, and raised his eyebrows. Aha, that is so, is it? I thought as much. Was it Sergius? We think so, said Tuppence, unblushingly. It would not surprise me. But you yourselves, you are under no suspicion. I do not think so. We handle a good deal of bona fide business, you see, explained Tommy. The Russian nodded. That is what. Yeah. All the same, I think it would be better if I did not come here again. For the moment I am staying at the Blitz. I will take Maurice. This is Maurice, I suppose. Tuppence nodded. What is she known as here? Oh, Miss Robinson. Very well, Miss Robinson. You will return with me to the Blitz, and lunch with me here. We will all meet at headquarters at 3 o'clock. Is that clear? He looked at Tommy. Perfectly clear, replied Tommy, wondering where on earth headquarters might be, but he guessed that it was just those very headquarters that Mr. Carter was so anxious to discover. Tuppence rose and slipped on her long black coat with its leopard skin collar. Then demurely, she declared herself ready to accompany the prince. They went out together, and Tommy was left behind, a prey to conflicting emotions. Supposing something had gone wrong with the dictaphone, supposing the mysterious hospital nurse had somehow or other learnt of its installation, and had rendered it useless. He seized the telephone and called a certain number. There was a moment's delay, and then a well-known voice spoke. Oh, quite okay. Come round to the Blitz at once. 5 minutes later, Tom and Mr. Carter met in the palm court of the Blitz. The latter was crisp and reassuring. You've done excellently. The prince and the little lady are at lunch in the restaurant. I've got 2 of my men in there as waiters, whether he suspects or whether he doesn't, and I'm fairly sure he doesn't. We've got him on toast. There are 2 men posted upstairs to watch his suite, and more outside ready to follow wherever they go. Don't be worried about your wife. She'll be kept in sight the whole time. I'm not going to run any risks. Occasionally one of the Secret Service men came to report progress. The first time it was a waiter who took their orders for cocktails. The second time it was a fashionable vacant-faced young man. They're coming out, said Mr. Carter. We'll retire behind this pillar in case they sit down here, but I fancy he'll take her up to his suite. Ah, yes, I thought so. From their post of vantage, Tommy saw the Russian and Tuppence cross the hall and enter the lift. The minutes passed and Tommy began to fidget. Do you think, sir? I mean alone in that suite. One of my men's inside behind the sofa. Don't worry, man. A waiter crossed the hall and came up to Mr. Carter. Got the signal they were coming up, sir, but they haven't come. Is it all right? What? Mr. Carter spun around. I saw them go into the lift myself. He glanced up at the clock 4.5 minutes ago, and they haven't shown up. He hurried across to the lift, which had just that minute come down again, and spoke to the uniformed attendant. You took up a gentleman with a fair beard and a young lady a few minutes ago to the 2nd floor. Not the 2nd floor. 3rd floor the gentleman asked for. The chief jumped in, motioning Tommy to accompany him. Take us up to the 3rd floor, please. I don't understand this, he murmured in a low voice. But keep calm. Every exit from the hotel is watched, and I've got a man on the 3rd floor as well on every floor. In fact, I was taking no chances. The lift door opened on the 3rd floor, and they sprang out, hurrying down the corridor. Halfway along it, a man dressed as a waiter came to meet them. It's all right, Chief. They're in no 318. Carter breathed a sigh of relief. That's all right. No other exit. It's a suite, but there are only these 2 doors into the corridor, and to get out from any of these rooms, they'd have to pass us to get to the staircase or the lifts. That's all right then. Just telephone down and find out who is supposed to be occupying this suite. The waiter returned in a minute or two. Mrs. Cortlandt Van Snyder of Detroit. Mr. Carter became very thoughtful. I wonder now, is this Mrs. Van Snyder an accomplice? Or is she? He left the sentence unfinished. Hear any noise from inside? He asked abruptly. Not a thing. But the doors fit well. One couldn't hope to hear much. Mr. Carter made up his mind suddenly. I don't like this business. We're going in. Got the master key? Of course, sir. Call up Evans and Clydesley. Reinforced by the other 2 men, they advanced towards the door of the suite. It opened noiselessly when the first man inserted his key. They found themselves in a small hall. To the right was the open door of a bathroom, and in front of them was the sitting room. On the left was a closed door, and from behind it a faint sound, rather like an asthmatic pug, could be heard. Mr. Carter pushed the door open and entered. The room was a bedroom with a big double bed, ornately covered with a bedspread of rose and gold. On it, bound hand and foot, with her mouth secured by a gag, and her eyes almost starting out of her head with pain and rage, was a middle-aged, fashionably dressed woman. On a brief order from Mr. Carter, the other men had covered the whole suite. Only Tommy and his chief had entered the bedroom. As he leant over the bed and strove to unfasten the knots, Carter's eyes went roving round the room in perplexity. Save for an immense quantity of truly American luggage, the room was empty. There was no sign of the Russian or Tuppence. In another minute, the waiter came hurrying in, and reported that the other rooms were also empty. Tommy went to the window only to draw back and shake his head. There was no balcony, nothing but a sheer drop to the street below. Certain it was this room they entered? Asked Carter peremptorily. Sure. Besides, the man indicated the woman on the bed. With the aid of a penknife, Carter parted the scarf that was half choking her, and it was at once clear that whatever her sufferings, they had not deprived Mrs. Cortlandt Van Snyder of the use of her tongue. When she had exhausted her first indignation, Mr. Carter spoke mildly. Would you mind telling me exactly what happened from the beginning? I guess I'll sue the hotel for this. It's a perfect outrage. I was just looking for my bottle of Killagrip when a man sprang on me from behind and broke a little glass bottle right under my nose, and before I could get my breath, I was all in. When I came to, I was lying here, all trussed up, and goodness knows what's happened to my jewels. He's gotten the lot, I guess. Your jewels are quite safe, I fancy, said Mr. Carter dryly. He wheeled round and picked up something from the floor. You were standing just where I am when he sprang upon you. That's so, assented Mrs. Van Snyder. It was a fragment of thick glass that Mr. Carter had picked up. He sniffed it and handed it to Tommy. Ethyl chloride, he murmured. Instant and anesthetic. But it only keeps one under for a moment or two. Surely he must still have been in the room when you came to, Mrs. Van Snyder. Isn't that just what I'm telling you? It drove me half crazy to see him getting away, and me not able to move or do anything at all. Getting away, said Mr. Carter sharply. "Which way?" "Through that door." She pointed to one in the opposite wall. "He had a girl with him, but she seemed kind of limp, as though she'd had a dose of the same dope." Carter looked a question at his henchman. "Leads into the next suite, sir. But double doors supposed to be bolted each side." Mr. Carter examined the door carefully. Then he straightened himself up and turned towards the bed. "Mrs. Van Snyder," he said quietly, "do you still persist in your assertion that the man went out this way?" "Why, certainly he did. Why shouldn't he?" "Because the door happens to be bolted on this side," said Mr. Carter dryly. He rattled the handle as he spoke. A look of the utmost astonishment spread over Mrs. Van Snyder's face. "Unless someone bolted the door behind him," said Mr. Carter, "he cannot have gone out that way." He turned to Evans, who had just entered the room. "Sure they're not anywhere in this suite? Any other communicating doors?" "No, sir, and I'm quite sure." Carter turned his gaze this way and that about the room. He opened the big hanging wardrobe, looked under the bed, up the chimney, and behind all the curtains. Finally, struck by a sudden idea, and disregarding Mrs. Van Snyder's shrill protests, he opened the large wardrobe trunk and rummaged swiftly in the interior. Suddenly Tommy, who had been examining the communicating door, gave an exclamation. "Come here, sir, look at this. They did go this way." The bolt had been very cleverly filed through, so close to the socket that the join was hardly perceptible. "The door won't open because it's locked on the other side," explained Tommy. In another minute they were out in the corridor again, and the waiter was opening the door of the adjoining suite with his pass key. This suite was untenanted. When they came to the communicating door, they saw that the same plan had been adopted. The bolt had been filed through, and the door was locked, the key having been removed. But nowhere in the suite was there any sign of Tuppence or the fair-bearded Russian, and there was no other communicating door, only the one on the corridor. "But I'd have seen them come out," protested the waiter. "I couldn't have helped seeing them. I can take my oath they never did." "Damn it all," cried Tommy. "They can't have vanished into thin air." Carter was calm again now, his keen brain working. Telephone down, and find who had this suite last, and when. Evans, who had come with them, leaving Clydesley on guard in the other suite, obeyed. Presently he raised his head from the telephone. An invalid French lad, in Paul de Vares. He had a hospital nurse with him. "They left this morning." An exclamation burst from the other Secret Service man. The waiter, he had gone deathly pale. "The invalid boy, the hospital nurse," he stammered. "Aye, they passed me in the passage. I never dreamed I had seen them so often before." "Are you sure they were the same?" cried Mr. Carter. "Are you sure, man? You looked at them well." The man shook his head. "I hardly glanced at them. I was waiting, you understand, on the alert for the others, the man with the fair beard and the girl." "Of course," said Mr. Carter with a groan. "They counted on that." With a sudden exclamation, Tommy stooped down and pulled something out from under the sofa. It was a small rolled-up bundle of black. Tommy unrolled it, and several articles fell out. The outside wrapper was the long black coat Tuppence had worn that day. Inside was her walking dress, her hat and a long fair beard. "It's clear enough now," he said bitterly. "They've got Tuppence. That Russian devil has given us the slip. The hospital nurse and the boy were accomplices. They stayed here for a day or two to get the hotel people accustomed to their presence. The man must have realized at lunch that he was trapped and proceeded to carry out his plan. Probably he counted on the room next door being empty, since it was when he fixed the bolts. Anyway, he managed to silence both the woman next door, and Tuppence brought her in here, dressed her in boy's clothes, altered his own appearance, and walked out as bold as brass. The clothes must have been hidden ready, but I don't quite see how he managed Tuppence's acquiescence." "I can see," said Mr. Carter. He picked up a little shining piece of steel from the carpet. "That's a fragment of a hypodermic needle. She was doped." "My God," groaned Tommy. "And he's got clear away." "We won't know that," said Carter quickly. "Remember, every exit is watched. For a man and a girl, not for a hospital nurse and an invalid boy. They'll have left the hotel by now." Such on inquiry proved to be the case. The nurse and her patient had driven away in a taxi some 5 minutes earlier. "Look here, Beresford," said Mr. Carter. "For God's sake, pull yourself together. You know that I won't leave a stone unturned to find that girl. I'm going back to my office at once, and in less than 5 minutes every resource of the department will be at work. We'll get them yet. Will you, sir? He's a clever devil, that Russian. Look at the cunning of this coup of his. But I know you'll do your best. Only pray God it's not too late. They've got it in for us badly." He left the Blitz Hotel and walked blindly along the street, hardly knowing where he was going. He felt completely paralyzed. Where to search? What to do? He went into the Green Park and dropped down upon a seat. He hardly noticed when someone else sat down at the opposite end, and was quite startled to hear a well-known voice. "If you please, sir, if I might make so bold." Tommy looked up. "Hello, Albert," he said dully. "I know all about it, sir. But don't take on so. Don't take on." He gave a short laugh, easily said, "Isn't it? But think, sir. Blunt's brilliant detectives, never beaten. And if you'll excuse my saying so, I happened to overhear what you and the missus was ragging about this morning, Mr. Poirot, and his little grey cells. Well, sir, why not use your little grey cells, and see what you can do? It's easier to use your little grey cells in fiction than it is in fact, my boy." "Well," said Albert stoutly, "I don't believe anybody could put the missus out for good and all. You know what she is, sir. Just like one of those rubber bones you buy for little dogs, guaranteed indestructible." "Albert," said Tommy, "you cheer me. Then what about using your little grey cells, sir? You're a persistent lad, Albert. Playing the fool has served us pretty well up to now. We'll try it again. Let us arrange our facts neatly, and with method." At 2:10 exactly, our quarry enters the lift. 5 minutes later we speak to the lift man, and having heard what he says, we also go up to the 3rd floor. At say, 2:19, we enter the suite of Mrs. Van Snyder, and now what significant fact strikes us? There was a pause, no significant fact striking either of them. "There wasn't such a thing as a trunk in the room, was there?" asked Albert, his eyes lighting suddenly. "Mon ami," said Tommy, "you do not understand the psychology of an American woman who has just returned from Paris. There were, I should say, about 19 trunks in the room. What I meant to say is a trunk's a handy thing if you've got a dead body about you want to get rid of, not that she is dead. For a minute, we searched the only 2 that were big enough to contain a body. What is the next fact in chronological order?" "You've missed one out when the missus and the bloke dressed up as a hospital nurse passed the waiter in the passage." "It must have been just before we came up in the lift," said Tommy. "They must have had a narrow escape of meeting us face to face. Pretty quick work, that." He stopped. "What is it, sir?" "Be silent, mon ami. I have the kind of little idea, colossal, stupendous, that always comes sooner or later to Hercule Poirot. But if that's it. Oh, Lord, I hope I'm in time." He raced out of the park, Albert hard on his heels, inquiring breathlessly as he ran, "What's up, sir? I don't understand." "That's all right," said Tommy. "You're not supposed to. Hastings never did. If your grey cells weren't of a very inferior order to mine, what fun do you think I should get out of this game? I'm talking damned rot, but I can't help it. You're a good lad, Albert. You know what Tuppence is worth. She's worth a dozen of you and me." Thus talking breathlessly as he ran, Tommy re-entered the portals of the Blitz. He caught sight of Evans, and drew him aside with a few hurried words. The 2 men entered the lift, Albert with them. "3rd floor," said Tommy. At the door of No. 318 they paused. Evans had a pass key, and used it forthwith. Without a word of warning, they walked straight into Mrs. Van Snyder's bedroom. The lady was still lying on the bed, but was now arrayed in a becoming negligee. She stared at them in surprise. "Pardon my failure to knock," said Tommy, pleasantly, "but I want my wife. Do you mind getting off that bed?" "I guess you've gone plumb crazy," cried Mrs. Van Snyder. Tommy surveyed her thoughtfully, his head on one side. "Very artistic," he pronounced. "But it won't do. We looked under the bed, but not in it. I remember using that hiding place myself when young, horizontally across the bed, underneath the bolster, and that nice wardrobe trunk all ready to take away the body in later. But we were a bit too quick for you just now. You'd had time to dope Tuppence, put her under the bolster, and be gagged and bound by your accomplices next door, and I'll admit we swallowed your story all right for the moment. But when one came to think it out with order and method, impossible to drug a girl, dress her in boys' clothes, gag and bind another woman, and change one's own appearance all in 5 minutes. Simply a physical impossibility. The hospital nurse and the boy were to be a decoy. We were to follow that trail, and Mrs. Van Snyder was to be a pitied victim. Just help the lady off the bed, will you, Evans? You have automatic. Good. Protesting shrilly, Mrs. Van Snyder was hauled from her place of repose. Tommy tore off the coverings and the bolster. There, lying horizontally across the top of the bed, was Tuppence, her eyes closed, and her face waxen. For a moment, Tommy felt a sudden dread, then he saw the slight rise and fall of her breast. She was drugged, not dead. He turned to Albert and Evans, and now, messieurs, he said dramatically, the final coup. With a swift, unexpected gesture, he seized Mrs. Van Snyder by her elaborately dressed hair. It came off in his hand. As Tuppence stirred, a dull ache throbbed in her head, and for a moment, she felt weightless, caught between the fading edges of unconsciousness and the murmur of voices around her. Then slowly, she opened her eyes. A blurry figure leaned over her, then another. As her vision cleared, she recognized the concerned face of Tommy, his brows drawn together in worry, and beside him, a doctor adjusting his spectacles with an air of professional satisfaction. "Ah, she's coming around," the doctor said briskly. "Good, good. Mrs. Beresford, you've given us quite the scare, but all is well now. Just take it easy for a while." Tuppence tried to sit up, but Tommy's hand pressed gently against her shoulder. "Not so fast, my dear girl, you took quite a tumble. Over the next 15 minutes, a veil is best drawn over the fuss that followed." The doctor's final check, Tommy fussing over her with uncharacteristic tenderness, and the overall flurry of concern. But eventually, the doctor left with a reassuring nod, leaving the two of them alone. Tommy exhaled deeply, and flopped onto a chair beside her bed, studying her with an affectionate smile. "Mon ami, Hastings," he murmured, his voice thick with relief. "How I rejoice that you are still alive." Tuppence blinked at him. "Have we got no 16? A slow triumphant grin spread across Tommy's face. "Once more have I crushed him like an eggshell," he declared dramatically. "In other words, Carter's got him." The little grey cells worked splendidly. He gave a thoughtful pause. "By the way, I've decided to raise Albert's wages." Tuppence gave a weak chuckle. "Tell me everything, no leaving out details." And so Tommy did, recounting the thrilling events with all the flair of a grand storyteller, though conveniently, leaving out a few minor incidents, where things had gone less smoothly than he'd like to admit. Tuppence listened intently, though her eyes never left Tommy's face. There was something in his expression, something behind the easy bravado, the casual storytelling, something raw. She saw it in the way his hand still clutched hers tightly, in the way he kept sneaking glances at her, as if reassuring himself that she was really there. "Weren't you absolutely frantic about me?" she asked softly. Tommy shrugged, attempting nonchalance. "Not particularly. One must keep calm, you know, liar," she said with a faint smile. "You look absolutely haggard. You were worried sick." Tommy hesitated, for the briefest of moments before relenting. "Well, perhaps I was just a little worried, darling." She squeezed his hand. "I say," Tommy ventured carefully, "we're going to give it all up now, aren't we? The danger, the spying, the close calls. You've had quite the scare, and surely after this." "Certainly we are," Tuppence said firmly. Tommy released a breath of relief, as though he had been holding it all this time. "I hoped you'd be sensible, after a shock like this." But Tuppence interrupted him, her eyes suddenly glinting with excitement. "Oh, it's not the shock, Tommy. You know I never mind shocks." Tommy groaned. A rubber bone. Indestructible. He muttered. Tuppence grinned mischievously. No. This is different. I've got something better to do. Something ever so much more exciting. Something I've never done before. Tommy sat up, alarm flickering in his eyes. He knew that tone, that unmistakable tone of Tuppence on the brink of some mad scheme. I forbid it, Tuppence, he said, feigning authority. You can't, she said, matter-of-factly, her expression glowing. It's a law of nature. Tommy narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about, Tuppence? Tuppence took a deep breath, and then with a dazzling smile she announced, I'm talking about our baby. Silence. For the first time in his life, Tommy Beresford was completely and utterly speechless. His mouth opened, then closed as his brain attempted to process the words. Tuppence giggled. Wives don't whisper nowadays, Tommy. They shout, our baby. A slow disbelieving grin broke across Tommy's face. He grabbed her hands, searching her eyes. You mean? Yes, she said softly. Isn't everything marvelous? Tommy let out a breathless laugh. The world, for all its dangers, for all its shadowy threats, suddenly seemed brighter. He pulled her into a careful but fierce embrace. Marvelous, he whispered. Absolutely marvelous.